Hello aspirants, today we are going to start a new series of English literature, a book, An Outline History of English Literature by William Hudson. I am going to read this book for you and you guys listen this carefully and enhance your English literature knowledge and feel proud to learn about English literature. It will help you in your course and also for competitive examination. So let's start. What is the history of English literature? Perhaps it seems hardly worthwhile to put this question because the answer to it is so very obvious. A history of English literature, we reply without a moment's hesitation, is simply a chronological account of the books which we have been written in the English language, and since we cannot think of a book without thinking also of its author, of the man who wrote them. In a rough way, this answer is alright so far as it goes, but it is too vague and it does not go far enough. It will be well for us therefore to pause at the outset of our own work to consider a little closely what it is that a history of English literature, however briefly, really involves. Stress may first of all be laid upon the personal element in it, which our answer already recognizes. We cannot, we say, think of a book without thinking also of its author. Every book, in other words, takes us back immediately to the man behind it, of whose genius it is a product and whose thought and feelings it embodies. In a history of English literature, therefore, we must fix attention upon the personalities of the man by whom this literature has been made. In a short sketch, we cannot, of course, examine in detail their lives, experience, and characters. This must be left for a more extended study, but we must try nonetheless to understand the distinctive quality of the genius of each man who comes before us. The reason of this is clear. Genius means many things, but at bottom it means strength of personality and, as a consequence, what we call originality. Every great writer, it has been well said, brings one absolutely new thing into the world himself, and it's just because he put this one new thing into what he writes that his work bears its own special hallmark and has something about it which makes it unlike the work done by anyone else. In the detailed study of any great writer, this essential element of individuality is the chief feature to be considered, and in an historical survey, no matter how slight, it must be carefully noted too, for otherwise we cannot learn why such a writer counts as he does in the literature of his nation. A history of English literature then is concerned to indicate the nature and value of the particular contribution which each writer personally has made to the literature. This, however, is only a small part of its task. A mere list of authors taken separately and of their books does not constitute a history of English literature. For literature as a whole grows and changes from generation to generation, and in tracing this growth, history must show the place which each writer occupies in it, and his relation with those who went before and with those who came after him. A writer of exceptional powerful personality is certain to stamp his impress upon his age, and amongst those who follow him many will always be found who, whether they are conscious of it or not, reveal his influence in their thought and style. However, the popularity obtained by any writer with a particular kind of work will naturally breed imitation, and what has once been done successfully will for a time be done again and again. In this way, schools are formed and movements initiated, which last for a while, and then when tastes presently change and other school and movement arise, disappear. Thus we speak of a school of pop, meaning the whole succession of poets who wrote in the particular style which he had brought to perfection and made current, of the classic movement in the verse which following his lead. These writers carried on of the romantic movement in prose fiction which owed its principal impulse to Scott's historical novel, and so on. Such a school and movement always play a large part of the development of literature and are often as important to the student as the individual writer themselves. It must remember too that even the most original man, the men who are most completely themselves, have their intellectual ancestry and are often deeply indebted to others for inspiration and example. I have just spoken of Pope's particular style, but this was not his own independent creation, and while it assumed perfection in his hand, it was really the final result of a long movement in verse which had already found one great representative in his immediate predecessor, Dryden. Scott was educated in a romantic school before he became in his turn a supreme master in that school. We frequently think of Shakespeare as if he stood altogether apart in the literature of his day, but in fact he took the drama up it the point which it had reached when he began to write for the stage and followed the line which his forerunner had laid down. The history of literature then must take account of all these things. It must bring out relationship between writer and group. It must test the rise, growth and decline of schools and movement. And whenever any given writer had been especially prominent in their evolution, it must consider the influence he exerted in making literature, either by keeping it in old channel or in directing it into new. We have, however, to go much further. Even than this. I have said that literature as a whole grows and changes from generation to generation. This means that as each has its own particular lines of interest and its own particular way of thinking and feeling about things, so the literature which it produces is governed by certain prevailing tests, that these tests last for a time only, and that the tests of one age are sure to differ and are often found to differ enormously from those of every other. Near as we are to great Victorian era, which was simply the era of our fathers, there is much in its literature which now seems as foreign to us as its fashions in dress. We all know that author did not write and that there was no public to enjoy the same kind of poetry in Pope's day as in Spencer's, or in Scott's day as in Pope's. In Spencer's day there was boundless enthusiasm for the Fairy Queen in Pope's, for the essay on man in Scott, the Lady of the Lake, not the great central purpose of this history of literature. The purpose to which everything else in it secondary and subordinate is to give a clear account of the whole transformation of literature from period to period, and so far as possible to mark out the causes which have combined to produce. Among these causes, as I have already suggested, we have to reckon the influence of individual man, for a great writer will often create a new taste and make a fresh departure in the literature of time, at while full weight must be given to personal initiative and example. We must be careful not to emphasize their importance to the exclusion of all other considerations. Even the greatest genius is necessarily molded by the culture, ideals and mental and moral tendencies of the world into which he is born, and the character of what he produces is therefore to large extent determined by these. If a man of powerful personality stamps his impress upon his age, as I have said, he also takes the impress of his age and the success of his work, entirely original as it may seem to be, is often due to the way in which it meets or anticipates the general taste of the public to which he appeals. In this sense, we have to regard every writer as a product of his time, and so regarding him, we have to inquire into the nature of the influence which shaped his thought, directed his taste, and helped to give a distinctive character to his work. Such inquiry, it is evident, will often lead us rather far afield. Sometimes the influence of questions are purely literary, that is, they belong to the sphere of books and scholarship. Thus, for example, one of the principal forces behind the English literature of the Elizabethan era was the immense enthusiasm for the Greek and Latin classics which had come with what we call the Renaissance. Our writers and readers alike were under the powerful spell of Italian literature during the same period, under that of French literature at the end of 17th century, under that of German literature 100 years later. While to give one more illustration, the re-awakening from about 1750 onward of popular interest in the long neglected art and literature of the Middle Ages inspires that in medieval revival which presently culminated in Coleridge and Scott. In such cases, we see how literature influences introduce new current of taste, which carry even the most independent writers along with them, but often the influence which most profoundly affect literature are not literary. They are influences which belong not to book and scholarship, but to general life, politics, society. Whatever brings fresh interests and ideas into the life of an age, whatever tends to modify its ways of thought and feeling and to change its attitude towards man and things, must of necessity enter as a rival factor into the making of its literature. We must never think of a book as though it were written outside the condition of the time and space. We must think of it as the work of man who, living in a certain age, was affected according to the nature of his own personality by the atmosphere and the movement of that age. The Reformation, Puritanism, and French Revolution, the enormous progress of science during the 19th century, it is enough to mention this to show the intimate connection between the history of literature and general history. We are now, I hope, in a position to realize what is that a history of English literature should undertake to do. Its principal object is to trace the progress of English literature through all its transformation from age to age, and in following the varying course of its development to explain the successive changes which have taken place in its matter, form, and spirit. It has therefore to consider the influence by which these changes have been wrought, and thus it becomes a record of both of individual men and their special contribution to the literature, and of the force, personal and impersonal, which went to the shaping of their work. Before starting the whole course, we are going to also understand about the English literature and English history. This suggests one point which is so important that I trust that the reader of these pages will think about it carefully for himself. Every man belongs to his race and age, and no matter how marked his personality, the spirit of his race and age find expression through him. A history of English literature has therefore a national as well as personal character and interest. It is not only an account of work done by a number of separate English writers, it is also an account of great body of literature which in its totality is to be regarded as the production of the genius of our English people. Everything that for good or evil has entered into the making of our nation's life has also entered into the texture of its literature. Ordinarily, English history is our nation's biography, its literature is its autobiography. In the one, we read the story of its action and practical achievement. In the other, the story of its intellectual and moral development. As we follow the history of our literature through all its transformation, therefore, we are brought into direct and living contact with the motive forces of the inner life of each successive generation and learn at first hand how it looked at life and what it thought about it. What were the things in which it was most interested and by which it was most willing to be amused, by what passion it was most deeply satiated, by what standards of conduct and of taste it was governed, and what type of character it deemed most worthy of its admiration. In studying English literature according to the chronological method of history, let us always try to think of it as a progressive revelation of the mind and spirit of the English people.